represented in the formal semantic literature, right? And Josh has been working mainly on languages of the Yolngu family, but also on Australian Creole. And he's been working on these languages from a formal semantic perspective, but also from a diachronic perspective, looking at grammaticalization processes and combining these different views on meaning to inform semantic theory, but also the description of these under-researched languages. I have looked at his dissertation, his very recent dissertation, and this dissertation focuses on linguistic displacement phenomena like tense and mood, and also negation and polarity, and how these categories interact in really interesting ways in these languages that Josh is looking at. And I believe that we will hear some of this work in his talk today, which I'm really excited about. So please, Josh, go ahead.
Great, you can hear me and see the screen all right? Yeah, I can't see anyone, so hopefully this is working. Yeah, I'm not sure why it's okay. Yeah, this is, yeah, you can see this. You can see my screen fine though, right? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, well, yeah, thanks so much for that. And like Anders said, I'm going to be talking about the verbal paradigm, the semantics of various inflectional categories in a number of well, no, in one Yolngu language in particular. My dissertation kind of like we said focuses a little bit more on the diachrony and variation within the family as well. But yeah, just to get us started, yes, so the languages I work on predominantly are from the Yolngu Matha family. So Djambarrpuyŋu is one of these Yolngu Matha languages, and Yolngu Matha is a subgroup of Pama-Nyungan, which includes pretty much, I guess, 90-odd% of the surface area of the continent, including Modbury, which Margaret just talked us about. So yeah, that's kind of where we are at the moment. What I'm going to be talking about today, like I said, is the semantics of the inflectional paradigm. So Djambarrpuyŋu verbs all inflect for one of 4 categories. So you can see across conjugation classes, of which there are, I think, 9 in Djambarrpuyŋu. There are, verbs will inflect for exactly one of these suffixes or these categories. So what they mean is a little bit harder to get at. What I'll be saying is that they encode tense and mood information, and so while existing descriptions tend to eschew a unified semantics for each category, what I'll be claiming is that if we develop an understanding of 2 quite rare cross-linguistic phenomena, including cyclic tense and the negative asymmetry with respect to reality status marking, then we can actually get at a unified semantics for each of those categories. Okay, so yeah, today I'll walk us very briefly through what is meant in like branching times models of I guess intentionality and displacement. I'll talk a little bit more about the language background. Wagilak is a relative of Djambarrpuyŋu's, which I'll use to sort of introduce us to what the inflectional systems of Yolngu languages tend to look like, before getting into Djambarrpuyŋu and these phenomena that I kind of just alluded to. So yeah, it'll be moving reasonably fast, I think. If anybody needs a clarification question, then raise your hand and I'll do my best. But hopefully there'll be a decent amount of time at the end. Okay, so what motivates a branching times model of modality as opposed to the parallel worlds ones, or world and time frames that we're potentially a bit more used to? This is like the stuff that Kratzer assumes. Is that built into this is this assumption that the past is fixed, so there's a fixity to the past, and the future can branch in any number of directions. So it kind of leans on the fact that futurity is, in fact, a modal concept as much as a temporal one, for which there's been a little bit of debate, but it seems like there's, I'm scared of saying consensus, but like something in that direction. People are aware of the modal nature of futurity. So what branching times does then is it assumes in the ontology a set of indices which are partially ordered. So what this means then is, like I said, given any index, which refers to kind of the equivalent of a world time pair in these other framing models, given any given index will have a single past, so the past is left linear, and multiple branching futures to the right. So you can see every single dot here has a single branch going left and then multiple going right. Okay, so yeah, this tree then in effect represents a metaphysical modal base, the metaphysical alternative futures. So this tree here represents the metaphysical alternative futures to I null. Which I'll be denoting with this little symbol here. That's following Stefan Kaufmann's work. If people are familiar with that. So another really nice payoff, as well as building in this metaphysical assumption about the fixity of the past and the openness of the future, is that, and this comes out a lot in Sheila von Prince's work, which I'm sure people in this workshop are like somewhat familiar with, is that we have this partially ordered set of indices, and the ordering relation, this precedence relation here, given any fixed context, will partition the tree into an actual domain, which I'm representing with a solid line, a potential domain, this dash line, and a counterfactual one. So given I star, the moment of speech, there are all of these indices in the future, like things that potentially could happen, things that actually did happen or are happening, and then things that didn't but could have, given if the past had developed in some other set of ways. Okay, so ultimately then, instead of times and worlds, what we have is indices and branches, which are totally ordered sets of those indices. Okay, so pivoting back to Australia, like I said, in the sort of north central area is a region referred to as Arnhem Land. The languages that I work on, the Yolngu languages, are spoken in northeastern Arnhem Land, and the Yolngu family is this complex cluster of dialects. Which is surrounded by a number of unrelated non-Pama-Nyungan languages. So what we're going to be focusing on today is the Western Dual variety spoken in Remagen, which is right here. So that's my field site. And in particular, a variety of Western Dual called Djambarrpuyŋu, which I'm not going to go too much into the ethnography of the area, but Djambarrpuyŋu is one moiety left of Western Dual. And what we see in Djambarrpuyŋu is that, and a number of other languages spoken in the west of this region, is that there are a number of interesting contact effects. So particularly in contact with these languages of Manning-Breda, the Buravan languages. So the two phenomena that I'm going to be speaking about today, with respect to Djambarrpuyŋu, are found in the Manning-Breda languages, but aren't found in the Yolngu varieties to the east. So again, points to a kind of aerial or contact phenomenon. What we do see then in across Yolngu is significant variation in the grammatical expression of tense and mood and aspect. So we have these cognate paradigms which can be shown to be reconstructible to some Proto-Yolngu variety, but where they differ a lot in quite striking ways is in their semantics. So in Djambarrpuyŋu and Wagalak, this language I'm going to sort of very quickly parenthetically drop us into, all verbs, like I said, inflect for one of four categories. Okay, so Wagilak or Radicality, which is spoken down here, where I've also got some original data collected in Mukul, which is down here. Yeah, is pretty well behaved, I suppose, in terms of its morphosemantics. So we have a three-way tense distinction, and then a fourth inflection that does this counterfactual work. So a present marker, a future marker, and a past marker, pretty straightforward. And then the past, and then if we can superimpose this onto our branching times model and say, when we're talking about the past, we use the past inflection, the present inflection, the future, or the potential situations, we use the future, and then in counterfactual situations, we use the past potential. So yeah, decently straightforward. Things aren't so easy when we pivot to Djambarrpuyŋu, which is the reason that I'm doing this work, I suppose. So like I'd said in that first slide, the two particular phenomena we're going to be speaking about have been recognized in some typological work. One is cyclic tense, which is described very briefly in Comrie 1985, and then the negative asymmetries, which people might know, Martin Yestemo's like huge typology of standard negation. So it's one of the subtypes of asymmetries there. Now, the point is, I guess, that assigning a metalinguistic label to Djambarrpuyŋu inflectional categories, unlike Wagilak, where we could say past, present, future, and past potential, is really non-obvious. So I'll be numbering them 1, 2, 3, and 4 throughout. And then once we get to the end, we might be able to come up with some clever metalinguistic gloss for each of them. Okay, so just to show one of these effects, that gets at the fact, that gets at how it can be immediately complicated to give a gloss for each form. If we look at the past domain, we see that the first inflection turns up when we're talking about the present. If we talk about this morning, then we use the third inflection. So if we talk about yesterday, we go back to using the first one. And if we talk about a few years ago, then we go back to using the third. So there's this temporal discontinuity between the intervals that are licensing given inflections. So yeah, we can't come out and say, well, Nama is present and Nanga is past, because that's clearly not what's happening. Because I can say, Ngara Nama Mukuna Barbaro, I saw my aunt yesterday, using the same form as the present. Okay, so there's a decent amount of descriptive work that's been done on languages of the area. This is from Melanie Wilkinson's 1991 PhD thesis. And this is the way that she's tried to conceptualize the domains of each of these inflections. You can kind of see that there's a lot going on. And again, here's the reason we say 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? Because yeah, there are a lot of labels in here. Now, the first is responsible for the past, the present, and the future. Well, okay, so where does that get us? The third is also the past. The second is also the future. And Irialis non-past, and negative past and negative present. And then the fourth is past Irialis habitual and negative. So yeah, again, what are we going to do with this? We can either gloss each inflection by its function, or we can just like throw our hands up in the air and be like 1, 2, 3, 4, which is what yeah, most people working on these have done so far. Okay, so here we go. Again, we're going to be moving through quite a bit of data. So yeah, if let me know if I need to slow down or if there are any clarification questions. But yeah, we'll get started by digging a little bit more into the cyclic tense. So what's going on in this past and present domain? Now, so what we've seen so far is that tense morphology is licensed by these discontinuous intervals, which as I said, is also reported in these Manning Reader languages to the west. So what's happening here is, if this is the time of speech and here is the day of speech, our utterance day, I can say I'm looking at my aunt right now. I'm talking about yesterday. I looked at her just before. I'd use the second form to talk about the future, now normal penamburar. So there we kind of have a recapitulation of the Wagyu-like system. But of course, where it gets more complicated, as we saw, is here. So if I want to talk about yesterday, ngara nama again, and if I talk about when I was a kid, ngara nama. Okay, so yeah, there's been a bit of work. I think Seth Cable gave a talk at this workshop a year or two ago about like temporal remoteness. So we kind of see a remoteness effect here, but it's more complicated than that because we also see that remoteness effect kind of recapitulated, which is what the cyclicity is. Now, so like summarizing what we have is, like just like a descriptively adequate account could say, well, if the time is today, then the first form gives us the non-past and the third form gives us the past. And if the time is before today, then the first form gives us the recent and the third form gives us the remote. So again, that kind of captures the bulk, modulo a couple of exceptions of what we want to be trying to model. And the existing account does say something like that. So there's an article by Kathy Glasgow from 1964. This picture here is the entire article. It's a one-page article in this 1964 Journal of Aboriginal Studies. And effectively, again, it's getting at the idea that whenever we're trying to establish temporal reference, we have these temporal frames, which are either today or before today, and then we have our tense marker or our inflection, and it's really a conspiracy of whatever the semantics of those inflections are with the given frame that gives us our temporal reference. Okay. And like I mentioned, one of the only places this turns up in existing literature is in this book on Burrata, the same language that Kathy Glasgow is working out on, by Leonard Comrie in 1985. And he names it cyclicity because ultimately, as far as he's concerned, this is a phenomenon that emerges out of the recapitulation of a similar form and function correspondence. Namely that the range of the third always precedes that of the first in some sense, but it sort of, it also doesn't. So yeah, again, what's actually going on here? And then he goes on to say that, like, although cyclicity must be acknowledged, we could appeal to its rarity as an excuse to ignore it, pretty much. Which I am hoping we might want to not do, actually, given that we're trying to like model natural language semantics. So again, this is, I guess I'm kind of working on the assumption that it would be nice to not marginalize cyclic tense. Okay, so yeah, the way that I've been thinking about this is by appealing to work by Ashwini Deo and Claire Kondaravti on the Indo-Aryan perfect, where it's diachronic work where they're trying to model the emergence of perfect readings out of erstwhile resultative markers or stative markers. And in order to do that, they define this relation that they call non-final instantiation. So given a interval I, which has this subinterval J, which is a final subinterval, so that they overlap with respect to the endpoint. Non-final instantiation is going to hold between a given property and those two intervals if we can find some interval K, which precedes J, in which the eventuality was instantiated effectively. So it's just saying that there's some interval, there's some final subinterval in our reference interval, and whatever the eventuality I'm describing is contained within some non-final subinterval. Okay. So we can use a similar relation to say that there's a lexical constraint that effectively establishes either codiurnal frame or pre-codiurnal frame. And like in the literature on temporal distance, we see in language after language that exhibits this, that there is something relevant about the day of utterance. It's probably the most common way of like partitioning the past domain, and also the future domain, I guess, the non-present domains. Yeah, based on whether a given eventuality was on the day of utterance or preceded or succeeded it. So we do have, this isn't arbitrary, it's motivated. And then what we can say is that contemporary eventualities are situated in final subintervals of F. So in the case of the today frame, the final subinterval includes the past moment forcibly, so includes the present moment forcibly, and in the like before today frame, it ends up being subjective, and we can show this because given different contexts, last year might receive first. An event that happened last year might receive first marking or might receive third. So yeah, there's a subjective, I guess, degree which can be exceeded or not, and that's what gives us that one. So yeah, contemporary eventuality is situated in final subintervals of some contextually given frame, and pre-contemporary eventualities are situated in those non-final subintervals. So we can kind of modify the non-final instantiation relation that we had before by saying that an index pre-contemporaneity holds of some index if the frame that index is contained within precedes some final subinterval. And again, we're going to need to fix what F can be and also what J can be. So again, in the case of the today frame, J is always going to be some extended now moment, some moment that includes the speech time. Okay, so yeah, because of this, given some fixed context, the pre-contemporary relation is going to establish a partition over the non-future domain. Okay, so we're armed with this relation now in our sort of quest to better understand cyclic tense, and in fact the inflectional system more broadly. And yeah, we'll see this kind of playing out in the next section and the conclusions as well. But what I've chosen to do is represent Djambarrpuyŋu inflections as partial identity functions. So this is the presuppositional or referential treatment of tense, which is being used a lot, I guess. And effectively, tense is going to restrict the domain. So it's going to impose some sort of presupposition on what the reference index can be. So in the case of the primary inflection, it's a complete identity function. So I'm going to be modeling this as just passing whatever the reference index is up into the derivation. And you may well see where I'm going with this analysis. The third inflection is going to presuppose that that index is pre-contemporary with respect to the context, with respect to the given reference frame in the way that we had defined before. So yeah, this is basically what it's going to look like. Again, the first is just passing the like a contextually divided reference interval up and saying I saw auntie at that time. And the pre-contemporary one is going to make sure that whatever index is passed up is pre-contemporary. So was either happening this morning, if we're talking about the day of speech, or was like in the remote past, if we're talking about not the day of speech, something before the day of speech. Okay, so yeah, like I've said, this primary inflection is analyzed as a neutral inflection, and in pre-contemporary predications, it's blocked by the third, which is more specific. So that is the first inflection, and the reason that we get a reading of like the contemporary reading is because it carries an anti-presupposition now of pre-contemporaneity, and this is due to various pragmatic principles related to scalar implicature and maximized presupposition. And in fact, Lisa Allen in a 2002 snippet does something similar with the English present tense, for example. Okay. So I've said all of this. I've given you, like, I was going to say nice formalism, I've given you a formalism, and yeah, you may be asking yourself, well, Josh, this is still a bit ad hoc. What's going on? Why these reference frames? Why these final intervals of these reference frames? And I think ultimately this is a hypothesis that's sort of kind of ongoing work, but I think it's going to end up coming down to a question of mode. So in discourse, in conversation, we're likely to be concerned with the difference between present and past. So events overlapping with the here and now, we're going to be talking about the day of utterance more, what we did this morning, what we're doing now, what we're doing later. Whereas in narratives, we're less likely to be concerned with the here and now. We're going to be recounting events that were completed prior to the here and now. So the upshot of this then is that the today frame, or the Hodjourno one, if you're a Latinist, the Hodjourno frame is associated with conversational modes, and the pre-Hodjourno one is associated with narratives and storytelling. And the distinction between these is culturally significant in these RH cultures in Aboriginal Australia. So yeah, the hypothesis is then that cyclic tense could be a reflex of this mode distinction, and the mode distinction has actually been categorialized or grammaticalized into these reference frames in one way or another. And this does, if people saw Rumi Pancheva's Salt talk from a few months ago, I think, or Nell's talk from a couple of years ago, she's been saying kind of similar things in comparing the historical narrative present of English to the Paraline Warani like tenselessness, which also does this apparent reference shifting stuff. So a little bit of support can be found again tentatively in, if we look at a narrative. So this is from a picture book written of a traditional story written in the 80s. It's a pretty unpleasant story about this girl and her two pretty aggro suitors. But yeah, what's happening here is her mother is asking each of them for gifts, and the narrator says says that the mum said this using the third inflection. So again, we're referring to the remote past. And then she enters into this sort of like quotation kind of mode, and is switching between primary and tertiary inflections, between 1 and 3. So this is pretty much picking out a yesterday past in this quoted dialogue portion, whereas this is picking out a remote past in this narrative mode. So again, we can kind of see in one like page of a storybook, when we're switching between a discursive and a narrative mode, we're actually getting these two different readings associated with these two different reference frames. Okay, so that's my sort of like ongoing attempt to motivate cyclic tense. And I guess the upshot of this is this diachronic hypothesis that the cyclic tense phenomena that are exhibited in Djambarrpuyŋu and related languages are a result of the reanalysis of present and past tense markers' apparently divergent usage in conversational contexts vis-a-vis narrative contexts. And as a result, we end up with this contemporary and pre-contemporary use emerging out of erstwhile present and past markers. Okay. All right. So. Okay for time. Yeah. All right. So that's phenomenon 1. All right. So that's cyclic tense, and that hopefully we feel a little bit more comfortable about what the distinction between the first and the third are. Now, what I haven't said a thing about is the second and the fourth. So what we're going to be doing now is working out how we can distinguish the first and third on one hand from the second and the fourth on the other hand. And one of the keys to this is going to be looking at the negative asymmetry. Okay, so yeah, just to get a sense of what the domains of the second and fourth inflections are, the second marking is associated with future orientation. So it co-occurs with a range of modal particles, particularly du, the future marker, and balang, which is this kind of variable force modal. With it's strictly circumstantial, it doesn't have an epistemic reading, but and neither does du. But yeah, effectively we have these two main modal particles and a number of another number of others that turn up every now and then. Two also occurs in imperatives. But yeah, so we can say Djambarrpuyŋu, so Djambarrpuyŋu funeral, Nāngu, so I'll see the funeral tomorrow with du, Nāngu Durwara, look at her mouth, and so the recorder might break. So all of these show uses of two co-occurring with one of these modal particles. I'm kind of assuming for current purposes that there's a covert deontic modal in imperatives. Again, this is a little bit controversial, obviously, but nothing really hinges on that, I don't think. Okay, so and then the for marking is used with counterfactuals, past and past habituals. So we have this circumstantial modal use again. The dog must have eaten the chocolate. A past habitual use. I used to swim there, and then this kind of counterfactual subjunctive conditional. So had I thought of it before, I would have spoken. So all of these again are these modal readings with from a past perspective. Okay, so following Djambarrpuyŋu's treatment of modals in English, I'm going to be treating du and balang as uniformly displacing the runtime of some eventuality forward. So they invariably have a future orientation. And then where they vary so far from what we've seen is in terms of present and past perspective. So whether we're effectively accessing alternatives like relative to the present moment, or whether we're accessing alternatives that existed in some past moment and most likely weren't realized. Okay, so hopefully nothing too controversial there. So then moving into the negative asymmetry, we saw in the last section how the distribution of the first and third inflections is governed by the cyclic tense system. Now, there are a number of overt operators, which, as you may start wanting to guess already, include du and balang, which constrain the distribution of the first inflection, and particularly the third inflection. And one particularly interesting phenomenon is the fact that the first and third are ungrammatical under negation. So we add a negative particle, and this is what happens to the paradigm. So I'm going to ignore the fact that the first turns up under negation only in same-day futures, not with the present, not with the past, only ever with same-day futures. I'm going to ignore that for the moment. I have some bonus slides on it if we have time, if people want to talk about that. It is very interesting. But yeah, effectively, here we have the same paradigm that we looked at earlier. So present with the first, today past with the third, future with the second, recent past with the first, and then remote past with the third, which isn't pictured here. We add a negative marker like Puyŋu, and suddenly we have a completely different system. Well, I guess future staying the same, but now we have present with the second, today past with the fourth, the basic effect then is that negative realis and irrealis predications are inflected identically, or like negative modal and non-modal predications or negative, are inflected identically. So we, whereas do and balang make a difference for for positive clauses, they no longer make a difference in negative clauses. We're already in the domain of the second and the fourth as soon as we have our negator. Okay, so just recapitulating that, what we've seen so far, 2 and 4 co-occur with future marking, with non-epistemic modals, and with negation. Right. Now the future and the modal part, we can probably unify that without too much pain, given that, like I alluded to right at the beginning, formal treatments of the future predict a range of modal uses for future morphemes. There's this sort of notion of the future being a type of modality in some sense. And then we in fact see epistemic uses for will, which is usually taken to be a future marker. So if I hear a knock at the door, I can say that'll be the postman. It's not the case that I'm describing some future state, like the postman is currently at the door, and Will is doing some sort of epistemic work there. So yeah, the way that we might want to deal with that formally is by saying that Will is universally quantifying over different types of conversational backgrounds, and yeah, context does work here. So can we unify all of this data then, particularly negation with the future marking and the modal marking data? Okay. Unsurprisingly, I'm going to be arguing for yes. Just again, just to quickly recap what we've seen so far, we have this pretty straightforward system in Wagulak, which gets complexified by cyclic tense, which we see in positive clauses, and then in negative clauses, we also see this asymmetry. So yeah, again, you can kind of see why we're using numbers and not clauses. Okay, so yeah, how can we think about negation in a natural class with modals? Modal operator, I think, is probably a bit strong, but are we talking about negation as a non-veridical operator, which hopefully is less controversial? So treating negation as a neighbor of modality actually does build on a decently rich symbolic logic tradition. Where negation has been construed as a species of alethic impossibility. So Van Singh has done some work on this. The basic idea is that you take a standard issue Kripke frame, a model and a world, and a model and a world are going to verify the negation of some proposition A if all worlds that are in some sort of compatibility relation with that world fail to verify the truth or the affirmation of that proposition A. So in a sense, it's again just doing this. It's doing this impossibility work. It's saying that we can universally quantify over the neighborhood or the modal frame, and we won't find any relevant worlds that turn up the truth of this proposition. So kind of Kratserifying this a little bit, and also branching timesifying this a little bit, Djambarrpuyŋu, the negative operators, can be understood as being of a natural class with the modal particles. So as a type of two-place operator. And the way we do this is by treating them as effectively a predicate modifier that says, give me a predicate and an index, and I'll say that there are no branches that are compatible with that index at which P holds. So again, yeah, this kind of might seem like a bit of formal black magic, and in the sense it kind of is. Generally negation is going, if we want to talk about in Kratzerian terms, is going to be quantifying over a totally realistic conversational background, which pretty much just contains which pretty much just contains worlds that are totally consistent, in fact definable by whatever propositions are true at that given index or at that given branch. But yeah, in any case, we can one of the takeaways here is that we can kind of we can kind of construe or conceive of a similar structure to between these modal operators and negative operators in one way. I can talk about that more, but don't want to get too bogged down on like the formal like nuts and bolts. But yeah, happy to sort of speak about this more in the question period. And we can see how this plays out and what this buys us in terms of thinking of negation as kind of shifting us, I guess, into the counterfactual domain of those branching time models that we saw before. Okay. Right. So in one way or another, the modal particles Djambarrpuyŋu signal what Anastasia Yanakidou refers to as objective non-radicality. So they just say that there's some world in a given modal base that, or at least compatible with some world in a given modal base let me slow down. So I guess a modal base, so what Yanakidou says is that a modal base is going to be non-veridical with respect to a given proposition if there are worlds in that modal base at which the proposition doesn't hold. So what this pretty much means for our purposes is that the truth of a given proposition can't be known or can't be asserted, therefore, as a settled fact in a given situation. So this is what happens if we're talking about a proposition that's non-veridical with respect to a metaphysical modal base. So our semantics for negative and modal operators, which happen to be those elements that co-occur with the 2 and 4 inflections, they all satisfy non-veridicality in some circumstantial modal base, which I'll be arguing suggests a treatment of these inflections, this inflectional paradigm, as encoding verbal mood, in addition to the tense distinction that we saw in the previous section. Now this is why I think it is like worth describing this as mood. It's super dissimilar to the indicative subjunctive distinction in European, particularly insofar as it's not the arealis is not licensed by subordinating predicates. So I can't, an embedded clause isn't going to automatically be receive second or fourth inflection just because the matrix predicate that's embedding it is anti-factive, for example. And also it's not licensed by epistemic modals. So which I can also talk about later if we have time. So I'm going to be claiming then that the paradigm realizes a systematic realis-arealis distinction. This is a notion that's both much used in the typological literature and also much maligned in typological literature. I think there's been a bit of a renaissance recently, particularly Manfred Krefft and Kilo von Prince's work have these formal proposals in with respect to the North Central Vanuatuan languages arealis moods. So I mean, I think it is a useful concept. But the point here is that for Palmer, while the arealis and subjunctive systems are distinguished on these syntactic grounds, as in a modal in, like a clause made modal in a matrix clause licenses an arealis but not a subjunctive, which is different to the subjunctive system I just mentioned. But where they are united is that they're both taken in some way or another to signal non-assertion. And I think the some way or another is worth thinking about and thinking through a little bit more. I think that sort of relates in a bunch of very nice ways to Natasha's presentation from this morning. What I'm proposing then is that the second and fourth inflections both realize a presupposition of objective or metaphysical non-veridicality on their reference index. So a reference index is going to be irrealis if there's some metaphysical branch as accessed at the beginning of the reference interval, at which in the future of that in a successor index to that index, the proposition or the property being modified, being the predicate does not hold. So effectively, what it does is guarantees that there's going to be some metaphysical alternative to the beginning of the reference interval posterior to which the pre-adjacent doesn't hold. So that is P isn't settled or P isn't determined. Like metaphysically. So again, this harkens back to some degree to Stephen Kaufman's work in 2002 and 2005. Okay, so how is it that this treatment of the irrealis gets us the negative asymmetry then? Well, beyond the negative asymmetry that Miestimor talks about, there's also a long philosophical tradition that emphasizes the asymmetries between positive and negative sentences, where negative sentences are taken to be pragmatically marked. Chapter 1 of Larry Hong's monograph has a wonderful overview of that debate. And one of the ways that this is spoken about is by saying that negative sentences suppose the corresponding affirmative in one way or another. We saw a really nice example of that at the beginning of Jens's talk yesterday, where he was introduced and said, "It's my second time not coming to Singapore this year." So why is that felicitous? That'd be a really strange thing to just assert out of the blue. I mean, it's presumably true for anybody who hasn't been to Singapore twice this year that could hold, I guess. But what it seems to do is, evoke some sort of alternative, metaphysical alternative at which, well, in fact, Jens could have or was going to be in Singapore, and that happened, and that sort of evocation happened. There were at least 2 opportunities at which he could have been, and then relevantly wasn't in Singapore this year. Okay, so if we have our sentence, I don't see my auntie right now, I can't see my auntie right now, then the way that we can kind of talk about this is by saying that, well, this sentence is true if there's at the speech time I'm not in a state of seeing my aunt, right? So that's what I'm asserting when I say I can't see my aunt right now. What it seems to presuppose, though, and this is the contribution of the second inflection, is that given some extended now at the beginning of whatever sort of pragmatically provided now interval, if at the beginning of that there were some alternatives at which the negation of the pre-adjacent, so the negation of I don't currently see my aunt, didn't hold. So that is, if there are some branching alternatives at which I do see my aunt that were metaphysically possible at the beginning of this interval, then, well, then the negation is going to be licensed, then the irrealis presupposition is going to be satisfied, while also making an unambiguous claim about the fact that I'm currently not seeing my aunt. So ultimately then, means right now I don't see my aunt, and it asserts that, and it presupposes that I could have been, effectively. So again, this is a counterfactual element that is evoked by negation that I was referring to earlier. Okay. I should wrap up. Okay, right. So in what sense does irrealis signal non-assertion? again, remains to be sort of like spelled out a little bit more, but effectively, the Aurealis domain, as far as Keeler is concerned, is the union of potential and counterfactual situations. So all of these situations that are metaphysically unsettled, and therefore they're unknowable for sure, and therefore they're kind of unassertable simpliciter without some sort of judgment or commitment modification. Okay, so this is my conclusion. What I've said is that the paradigm of Djambarrpuyŋu encodes tense and mood, and this is organized around two semantic features: non-veridicality, which is the Aurealis presupposition that we spoke about before. So if we have this kind of maximally unmarked first inflection, then the second inflection picks out everything that's, again, a sort of non-actual successor index of either the current or past intervals. And then the pre-contemporaneity one, like property, which gives us this cyclic tense, which, effectively we have this 2x2 typology where like we have four inflections, which can either be plus minus Aurealis and plus minus pre-contemporary. And we're effectively at all points trying to maximize the presuppositions that hold of a given reference index. So again, all of this comes down to a blocking type account where one anti-presupposes all of the things that 4 presupposes, for example. So 4 is our most restricted, inflection. 2 and 3 have one of these restrictions, and then 1 is maximally unmarked and does all of the rest of it. Right. So so we saw that cyclic tense could be conceived of as the conventionalization of mode and register. We gave a treatment of negative operators that predicts their Aurealis licensing behavior. And we've seen how the Djambarrpuyŋu inflectional paradigm encodes a presuppositional tense and node distinction, where each of the inflections is a partial identity function which imposes felicity conditions on the reference indices by appealing to the interaction of these two properties. And then you can see my dissertation if you, for like further intricacies and composition and so forth. So Ooh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Josh, for this really, really cool talk. Very brave work also, I want to say. So let me thank you in the name of everybody who's ever worked on the semantics of modality and tense for tackling that. So let's hear some questions. Natasha has a question.
So it's actually a comment. So if somebody wants to go first, they should go ahead. So, I have a comment on the semantics that you seem to be using for future. There are reasons to believe that, at least in English, we don't want to have quantificational semantics for will. There's work by Kaviani and Santorio paper in mind, and also Kaviani's book on actually modal future, so probably interesting for you if you're not already aware of it. And one of their arguments is based on the interaction of negation. So linguists know that there are certain compositional problems, there are many ways to solve it, but maybe here too we don't want to have a typical criterion semantics. Maybe also we would want to have something else, still maintaining the idea that future is a modal. So something for the future maybe of interest to you.
Yeah, right. I'm not sort of familiar with those accounts. I guess I was kind of, just assuming a kind of, I evoked Cleo's work, but also like, Dorrit Abush's like wall and that sort of thing as this universal quantifier. But like, absolutely, I'd be really interested in taking.
It's not an attack.
Yeah, I mean the distribution. I'm not sure. Yeah, the distribution of dual. Which I was calling the future market. I mean, the future. I didn't really give a disclaimer of this, but the future gloss for that is a bit heuristic. It does do other types of like modal necessity as well. I mean, yeah, I guess So like, I mean, you can say things like, you know, you must wear a helmet using dual and stuff like that. So yeah, again, there seems to be a hard restriction on these modal particles receiving epistemic readings, but when it comes to other ordering sources, yeah, and like, you know, with circumstantial metaphysical modal bases, what have you, it seems to be both dual and biling seem to be really pretty flexible. Yeah, but cool. Yeah, no, I would love to take a look at that monograph and that work.
Okay, next question would be by Augustina.
Thank you, that was a great talk. Unfortunately, I missed some part of it because the volume kept fluctuating. So I wanted, this is a clarification question. So for the particle that has the future reading, does it always have to occur with a modal marker, or it can occur along with a future reading?
So this is the 2 and the 4 inflections?
Yes.
Yeah, so 4 is going to always occur with some sort of other operator that is doing the modal work. And the only time 2 in Djambarrpuyŋu turns up without one is in these imperative contexts, which was part of the reason that I wanted to assume that there was a kind of covert dual or something like that there. Because I mean, you also can create imperatives using dual as well. But I suppose that's part of the reason that I wanted to treat 2 and 4 and this sort of Irialis contribution as an Irialis and as a mood, because they are kind of what people like Palmer and Matthewson and so forth have called like redundant, because they're kind of like not doing modal work themselves, but they are kind of there marking the non-veridicality in like a similar way to how the subjunctive in French is pretty redundant in most circumstances as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, Mitchell, next question.
Thank you, Josh. So one question about the cyclic tense. And so you described at the end of that section that, you know, diachronically, this may have developed from some kind of distinction between, you know, contemporary discourse versus some narration, right? And I was wondering if actually synchronically, whether there are other observable differences between those modes as well. So in other words, when describing, you know, today events versus past, you know, non-today, you know, could there be some other vestiges of something that actually seems to describe narration, right? So for example, I don't know exactly what to look for, but I'm wondering if the interpretation of some indexicals might be different, or some kind of judges or something like that, you know, giving you a kind of indirect discourse kind of flavor to everything that is pre-today. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. It's not something that I have looked into too much. Like, this hypothesis actually kind of like in the sort of like long, boring afternoons in ramming beginning, like this hypothesis kind of like started forming towards the end of my last field trip. And yeah, and so I didn't have time to sort of test that sort of thing, but that did particularly the demonstrative and like, you know, other types of indexable systems, I suppose, but like particularly the demonstrative system, which is like super rich in like many Australian languages. Yeah, like there are 4 different, like, you know, there are 4 different like distinctions, all of which inflect for like, yeah, all of which inflect for different like morphosyntactic roles, I guess. But yeah, it would, no, I think that's something I hadn't thought of, and I think would be really worthwhile looking into. Yeah, in early conversations with Hidasa, in fact, we were talking about like, yeah, expressions like, so the way that what I've been translating is now in a couple of those examples, Djambarrpuyŋu literally means at this, kind of at this and moving away, at this point and moving away from it. And like an immediate past motive is like at this point just now, or something, or that's just completed, or something like that. So yeah, it really feels like there are a bunch of interesting ways in which the demonstrative system could interact with this. And yeah, I mean, I don't have anything off the top of my head to like add now, but I think, yeah, that's definitely worthwhile looking into. Thanks for that.
So the time is up, but since this is the last talk, I'm a bit unwilling to force the end of this conversation. Would you agree to continue a little bit? Then Malte would have the next question.
Oh, I would, absolutely.
Okay, good. It's most important.
Yeah, it's not a question, it's just a comment, since Anna is probably too modest to bring this up. So I quite liked your like parallel treatment of like negation and other like future and modal operators, and you can probably find more like evidence for this from certain West African languages like Hausa that Anna worked on, where you have like the same form marking under all these operators you've listed, right? Negation, future. And then you also have it in imperative, you don't see a formal marker, right? It's just like a bare clause with this marking and it's translated. So like prima facie, the parallels are quite striking, and like the intuition and the informal descriptions of this in house have always been something like this marking always occurs when some event is non-instantiated. So so like superficially that look fairly parallel, and I would guess that Hausa is not the only language you would find this. It normally goes under the label of subjunctive marking or something. So yeah, so just as an additional piece of support for your story, I thought this quite coming from Hausa, I found this quite convincing.
Okay, yeah, no, that's yeah. I have looked. I mean, of course, I have looked at like a bunch of your work, and yeah, but no, I should.
Not as a criticism or anything. It just I thought that like that somebody sort of like criticize you on this point. At least you can bring up this reassuring evidence. Like, well, this is not the only way you see this, right? But just
yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. Thanks for that.
Okay, so if I may add just one other comment that relates to what Mitchell said, actually. I found it interesting that you brought up this work by Rumi Pancheva and Zubizarreta, I think, because this thing with the, how do you call it, temporal frames, that also, right, and the narratives that also reminded me of that. So one thing I didn't get, or maybe that I missed, the temporal frames in the end now still have to be kind of stipulated, right? So that doesn't really fall out from anything. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, they kind of have to be specified. Like, these are the things that you get. This is the frame and the corresponding final subinterval that like are going to kind of you're going to have an option between when you're making a non-future predication, at least.
Yeah. So what I'm getting at is that so Pancheva and Zubizarreta, they frame this very differently, right? So what they do, and what I was always kind of skeptical about in Paraguayan Guarani, they kind of shift the evaluation time around all the time, right? That's what they do. They say, okay, in Paraguayan Guarani, you can shift the evaluation to the past, the evaluation time, and then you, yeah, whatever. So that's their tenselessness analysis, basically. And that always made me really uncomfortable because it messes up our whole system, sort of, right? We want the evaluation time to be the utterance time in matrix clauses, period. But then looking at your data, it looks almost a bit like this might be a point of cross-linguistic variation, that like some languages maybe actually can do that. And then your language shifts it to the day before the utterance time. So this is, I mean, this might be really nice evidence for this kind of idea that they are proposing, which I don't really like, but if we have cross-linguistic evidence, I'm on board. So just as a comment.
Sure. Right, no, cool. I hadn't thought of that connection. But yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess these sort of like index shifting and the number of indices that need to be sort of like actually built in. Is something that I feel like I'm kind of still grappling with. So that connection wasn't one that I had really, I guess, thought through. I guess I only saw that talk a month ago, but I can't really consult this. This whole year's been a blur, but I mean,
yeah, maybe you should talk to them. Maybe they'll be happy about your data. Okay, so I think thank you again for this great talk. And I think I will hand back to the organizers now if there is something else going on.